To be honest with you, I consider that it's a privilege to be able to interview anybody, whether he's Pele or whether he's an under 18 player trying to make it in the A-League. Because these guys would have given me some of their time, they would have respected me and given me time to ask them questions and sit down with me over for 10, 15 minutes. So it doesn't really matter who I was interviewing. I always thought it was a privilege.
Former sports journalist and author of quote unquote my top 100 football stories, Philip Micallef. Welcome to Sports Legends with Bevo.
Thanks, Bevo. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Now, here's your wonderful book, as I've just mentioned it. Everyone should go out and get yourself a copy of this. It's an absolute beauty, especially fans of the world game. Tell us all about the book, what it's all about.
When I retired about 9 months ago, I got a call from a publisher. And she said to me, Philip, why don't you write a book? I said, what about? She said, well, you've written a few stories in your career. Why don't you go into your study and pick your best stories and publish them in a book? I said, okay, that's interesting. I said, how many do you want? She said, what? I said, 20, 30? No, she said, 100. I said, 100? So I went into my records and sort of tried to pick the 100 best stories I wrote, which were mostly opinion pieces and interviews with big players, a few news stories here and there, but mostly they were opinion pieces and features and interviews with personalities, local and foreign. So I collated the best 100, and I think I've come up with a decent lot.
And we'll speak a bit later on about some of your favourite ones and some of the unexpected interviews you've had throughout your time. But let's go back to where it all began. Now, back in the 80s, you began as a sports journalist. Tell us, your first role, where you got that passion for, wanting to be a journalist and sort of where it met your expectations on day one.
Well, I'm Maltese, okay? And I sort of started dabbling with journalism when I was still in Malta. But when I came to Australia in 1981, my first job was on the Illawarra Mercury in Wollongong. And it was good because it was a perfect launching pad for me. And I'm eternally grateful to the Mercury in Wollongong because they gave me a good grounding. I had a bit of experience from Malta, but of course, journalism here is more professional. From there, I went from step to step towards, a fairly decent career, I think.
And day one, I know it was a long time ago now, but did it sort of meet your expectations and, any sort of challenges there where you thought, wow, this is a pretty tough gig?
Yeah, look, I was put on the subs desk in the news section, not in the sports section of the Mercury. So my first job was to prepare and sub stories for the top part of the paper. And I found it okay because I had a bit of a grounding from University in Malta in journalism. So it wasn't exactly foreign for me, even though my specialty was sport, particularly soccer, football. But I could handle it all right. And I quite enjoyed it for a start, yes.
When did you feel like you'd made it as a sports journalist, Philip? When was that sort of moment where you thought that, that real, light bulb moment where it's like, I'm really a sports journalist. I'm living the dream. This is awesome.
Yeah, I'll tell you how. It was a very, very lucky break, actually, to be honest with you. As I said to you, I was working on the subs desk at the Mercury in Wollongong, and the football writer of the paper, he got sick. And the editor came up to me. He said, listen, mate, you're Maltese, aren't you? So you got to love football. And I said, yes. He said, why would you mind filling in for Phil Murphy while he recovers, because we need somebody to cover Wollongong City in the National Soccer League. And I started covering the Wollongong Wolves, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. And I started to make a name for myself, and it went from there because I used to follow Wollongong home and away. The Mercury had a deal with the local radio station, and they used to subsidize my trips when Wollongong City played away. And in those days, the National Soccer League, you could play in Adelaide, Brisbane, Canberra, so it was good because every other week I used to go interstate, and it was fantastic. It was a lovely job. It was a very special experience for me because I used to cover just one team, and my job was just one team. And all my stories all the stories I wrote were just about one team. So it can sound daunting, but it's easy in a way because you're always concentrating on just one particular team.
And how good being able to travel interstate and seeing all these different games, with the sport you love.
Yeah, I mean, for example, if Wollongong City were due to play, say, Adelaide City in Adelaide, we used to leave early in the morning at 7, by plane. We get there, have something to eat, go to the football and come back that same day. So it was good. I enjoyed it, yeah. It made me feel like a professional football journalist at last.
Now, let's go back again to the start of your journalism career. When was your first real big failure and just feel as though it set you on the path to becoming a sports journalist and having a very successful career?
Well, I've been going for a long time. So to be honest with you, don't take this the wrong way, but I don't think I had any failures per se. But what I will tell you is this, that when I first started writing, I got the experience of negative reactions from the readers. And after the first abusive calls I used to get, those days we didn't have internet, thankfully, or Twitter. But these abusive calls and negative comments about what I used to do and write became a spur for me because I said, look, I can't let these people let me down or put me down because otherwise you're gone. So I took that as a motivation to keep going. And it is when I established this thing in me, which every opinion writer has to have, that you got to be sure of what you're writing and you got to be unflinching, so to speak, because the moment you start pandering to the wishes or the needs of people that might contradict what your views actually are, then you're gone, you're finished because you've got no leg to stand on. So I always stuck to my principles. I always stuck to my beliefs and come what may. And in turn, you learn to, dismiss negative comments. Today, you get abusive comments all the time. When you're called an idiot, it means I'm having a good day these days.
You're right though. With social media, I was speaking before to my producer Rory. It's one of those things where you've got those keyboard warriors, don't you? And you've just got to ignore them because at the end of the day, they're probably jealous of what you're doing because they're doing a boring job, or they're probably just dead beats that don't even have a job. So
exactly.
Yeah. Tell us what particular celebrity left you starstruck and why, Philip.
In 1999, I think I interviewed Michel Platini, the famous French legend, who played for Juventus and the national team of France for many years. And he was in town in Sydney because I think the next day there was going to be the inauguration of Stadium Australia in Sydney. That's for the Olympic Games in 2000. And I went up to him at the Sheraton, I think. I was there to do another interview with somebody else. But anyway, when I finished that interview, I went up to him. I said, listen, I'm Philip Micallef, blah, 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 blah. Do you mind if we have a chat? And we had a chat and we kept going on forever because he kept talking and talking and talking. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is this, that, when you interview somebody who is famous, like an ex-footballer or something like that, the standard question is always, what was the highlight of your career? Okay?
Yep.
And I asked him that. And he said to me, I've got no doubt, it was the 1982 World Cup semi-final against Germany. I said, you got to be kidding, are you? He said, why? He said, how can you, you guys were leading 3-1 in extra time and you lost on penalties, World Cup semi-final, and you regard that as the highlight of your career? What's going on? Well, you can't be serious. He said, yes. I said, why? He said, because I was one of 22 players who had the privilege of playing in arguably the greatest match that ever was played. I said, damn.
That's a good answer.
And he blew me because he said, look, it doesn't matter that we lost. The French, we've been losing for 100 years. So what's another defeat? It doesn't really matter. But it was such a great match, and it was, mind you, it was a fantastic, one of the all-time classics of world football. But fancy saying that when you're leading 3-1 in extra time and you lose. On penalties, and you still regard it as the highlight. But that's a bit of Gaelic logic for you, isn't it?
That's actually, it's actually fantastic and such a positive frame of mind. And we hear so much negativity in the media these days, and I'm sure you have throughout your journalism career. And you're right. That's actually really nice and uplifting to hear those sort of stories.
Yeah, that's true. But, I mean, the French those days were always good, but not quite there. And that was in the days before Zidane came along, and changed everything. But he said, look, it didn't really matter. In the dressing room afterwards, everybody was crying and slapping ourselves on the back, for running the Germans so close, and it was no big deal. We were just happy to play in a marvelous football match. In fact, to be honest, I still find it hard to believe in this modern day and age. Can you imagine this sort of thing happening when there's so much at stake and so much money and so much prestige and pressure and blah blah blah? But anyway, that was it. So he really threw me.
Yeah, no, I like that one. Great story. Now, you just spoke about an amazing interview you've done. Tell us about a couple more interviews throughout your career, Philip, that you've done that really sort of threw you a bit. Where you got an answer that was quite unexpected, or something perhaps really controversial.
What?
Well, the thing is that the unexpected bit came in this last question you asked me about Platini, but the controversial came a few years later. I'll jog your memory. In 2005, Australia played Uruguay for a place in the World Cup, okay? When we famously beat them in Sydney and went through.
Of course,
okay?
Yeah.
For the first time in 32 years. I was working for the Daily Telegraph then. Australia lost the first leg in Montevideo 1-0, okay? And I was in the Sydney office preparing the coverage for the next day. We had about 3 or 4 pages. I was dealing with a little story, a reaction type story from the Uruguayan side of things, okay? And it was only about 6, 7, 8 paragraph story. And it dealt with some comments from their captain, Montero, and blah, blah, blah. And in the last paragraph, it was a wire story from South America. In the last paragraph, there was this quote saying from Álvaro Recoba, their star player, saying, Uruguay have a divine right to play in the World Cup. I said, gee, this is a good story. But I did not have enough to go with it and change the story around and lead off the story with it, because there was nothing really to it. So, and besides, it was very low on the page and back in the book. And I said, this would not have any effect anyway, even if we ran it with just a headline or just an intro. So I cut it out. I cut the paragraph out so as not to alert anybody else from the media. And I waited for Recoba to come to Sydney 2 days later for the return leg in Sydney. And I went up to him and I said, I can speak Italian. And he obviously could too, because he played for Inter those days. And I went up to him. I said, listen, mate, a couple of days ago, you said that Uruguay had a divine right to play in a World Cup. I said, what do you mean by that? Can you elaborate and explain why you would say that? Because it was a discourteous remark, wasn't it? Anyway. So he said, look, of course, we've got a right because we are Uruguay. Uruguay are Uruguay, he said. We've got a history, we've got tradition, we won the World Cup, and Australia should respect this. We've got a right to be there, as distinct to Australia, so to speak. It was a big story. So I went straight to the office and wrote the story. I think they put it on the back page on the Telegraph. I'd like to think, I don't know whether any of the Socceroos players saw that story, but I'd like to think that if they did, it probably could have given them that extra motivation to beat the buggers, And they did beat them 1-0, and we got through to the World Cup. Uruguay might have felt that they had a right to be there, but we had the right because we actually won.
Now, you've spoken about some of the unexpected or different type interviews you've done. What's been some of your favourite interviews throughout your journalism career and why?
I'll tell you this from a start, okay? I had my favorite interviews, but to be honest with you, I consider that it's a privilege to be able to interview anybody, whether he's Pelle or whether he's an under-18 player trying to make it in the A-League, because these guys would have given me some of their time. They would have respected me and given me time to ask them questions and sit down with me over for 10, 15 minutes. So it doesn't really matter who I was interviewing. I always thought it was a privilege. But of course, I had my favorites. I've interviewed Pelle, I've interviewed Maradona. As I said before, I've interviewed Platini and Recoba and Zico, and Baresi, Milan captain, and other players. Jeff Hurst, the only player to score a hat-trick in a World Cup final, and Gentile, the Italian defender. And they're all in my book. All the interviews are in my book. But my favorite would be I still think Platini's was my favorite, but I liked the sheer thrill of interviewing Maradona and Pelle. For example, Pelle, I had a one-on-one with him, but I was about the 15th person to have a one-on-one on him that afternoon. and I was amazed how he could talk with such enthusiasm for each and every one of us when, under normal circumstances, I would have been sick and tired of it after 2-3 interviews. But this guy is so used to talking to people that he kept going with the same enthusiasm. And I was one of the last ones after about 15 at somewhere in Sydney, I can't remember, some hotel. But he was so friendly, so genuine, and so helpful, and so he made me feel like he was enjoying talking to me. Now, perhaps he was not, but he made it look like he was. That was Pelle. With Maradona, it was a bit different. I mean, the lasting impression I got of Maradona was how small he is. He looks like an under-18 player. He looked when I spoke to him, because I remember in 1993 when Australia played Argentina for the rights to play in the 1994 World Cup, Maradona had gone on this slimming exercise to cut his weight down after the 1-year ban for drugs, okay? And he was really skinny and small. And he was so small. I said, Jesus, this guy is such a huge name with such a small body. And I went up to him and said, can I have a bit of a chat, please? He said, yes, 3 questions, he said. 3 questions, that's it. So I started talking, but I got him. Because with every answer, with the first answer he gave me, I kept asking him, yeah, but what do you mean? Can you explain or can you expand? So this one question became 3 or 4. So by the time we finished, he gave me about 12 answers. and a bit of I had a decent story as well, because he was talking about how gifted players like himself were not being protected by referees. And he might have been playing mind games, he might have indirectly seeking a bit of protection from the referee for the match against Australia, from the referee, I should say. But he was good. He was nice. Again, I spoke to him in Italian, but he was playing for Napoli before that, he could speak Italian pretty well. Okay, but they were good. Pelle and Maradona, I'm proud to have interviewed them.
Very much so. A lot of people are pretty envious of that. 2 of the absolute legends of all time, not only of the world game, but sport in general.
Yeah. It's good. Sometimes you have highlights in your career. That probably would have been one of them.
And before we let you go, Philip, last year you decided to retire after an amazing career in journalism. We spoke about all the amazing people you've interviewed, and it's in your book as well. Any regrets? And I guess, what made you decide to pull the pin after all those years?
My last job was working for the World Game website from SBS, okay? And last June, they decided to pull the plug. I sort of took it as a great opportunity for me to call it quits because, as I said, I was 71 last year. I've had my career. The media game is changing. It's all about clickbait these days and whatever. So I'm not exactly sure whether I fit into modern journalism, to be honest, because I'm an old school blog. I'm not exactly happy with the way things are going at the moment because it's all about clickbait. Quality is not important anymore. But anyway, that's it. So I took it as a great opportunity to just step aside and let the younger guys take over, basically.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good response, and certainly you ended your career on a high, and certainly got a lot to be proud about. So, and I tend to agree with you. I prefer the old school journalism way as well. And I'm a journalist for a local newspaper, and so one of the few newspapers that's around these days because it's so online. There's still a space for the old school journalism way, and I sort of tend to prefer that rather than the clickbait as well. But I guess that's the way we've got the modern times, isn't it? Things have changed.
That's exactly right. But anyway, good luck to anybody, but it's not for me anymore anyway. So I've had my career. I'm happy. I'm happy with what I've done. So now I can sit back and just relax.
Well, you've certainly got a lot to be proud about. And once again, your book is called, quote unquote, My Top 100 Football Stories. get yourself one of these great books because it is a ripper. Anyone that loves sport or the world game, it's available at all your usual bookstores and online as well. Philip Micallef, thanks so much for joining us today on Sports Legends with Bevo and reminiscing about your amazing career. I've really enjoyed the chat and I look forward to speaking again in the future.
Thank you very much, mate. Thank you for having me, and I enjoyed the chat.